welcome to the special transmission with regards to the budget 2023 to 2024. Of course, this budget has been unveiled today with the Finance Minister SLARA speaking in the National Assembly and talking about a very important budget, something that he called is a responsible budget by the government and not an election budget. And this is, of course, in line with what has been going on in the country for quite some time now. We know that we've had very much difficulties with regards to the economic conditions for quite some time now, and then also especially in terms of our program with the IMF, which unfortunately we still haven't seen come around. But the Finance Minister reiterated that he is hopeful that that in fact will come around, even though the first week of the last month when this program expires has already passed. Again, it was also a question whether or not the current budget will help us towards achieving that goal or take it away from that, with of course the kind of issues still present, with some experts saying that perhaps the IMF may not be impressed by the current budget. But it may be seen what exactly that is going to be and why that is the case, and we'll discuss more about that in the show. For now, we know from what we've heard from the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister that all obligations of the IMF have been met, and what the government has tried to do in this budget is make a balance between the obligations that it has towards the economic sector and the IMF, and also towards providing relief to the people and the masses, which has of course seen a lot of issues with reference to what the people have been facing in terms of the cost of living crisis, the inflation rates, and of course the increase with reference to the utility prices as well. The budget promises some relief measures with regards to the PSDP and a number of initiatives by the Prime Minister which have been targeted to be provided within the fiscal year as well. We also know that when we talk about this budget, it is important to put it into practice with different sectors that have been highlighted by the Finance Minister, including agriculture, IT, and of course providing incentives to the industry, especially in terms of the tax incentives, and of course at the same time balancing revenue collection as well. We also know that the expectation of increase in salaries has also been there with reference to also government employees, minimum wages and pensions, and it's important in terms of how the government wants to proceed forward with all of these measures, especially in light of the difficulties it sees. There is a lot of talk also with regards to whether or not this is something that is going to help the country move out of the crisis and actually move towards reforms, whether or not that is part of the way the budget is moving towards any direction that can provide this relief for the masses and is not short-lived in its incentives. So we're going to be exploring a lot of what this budget entails and what exactly will be the outcome in terms of where Pakistan stands. For this and more, of course, we're going to be exploring exactly what the budget actually talks about as well, and then of course move on to the different areas in which the government wants to provide relief to the masses. For this, I've been joined of course in the studios by our analyst Farrukh. Pitafi is always part of our transmissions. We've also been joined by Ahmed, who's part of the Islamabad Industrial Association. Thank you very much, Ahmed, for joining us. We've also been joined by Mr. Ali Salman, Executive Director, Prime Institute. All of these gentlemen are with us in the studios, and we've been joined by Dr. Niaz Murtaza online as part of this special transmission. Thank you very much, Dr. Niaz, for being a part of the discussion as well. Let me start with you, Mr. Ali. The incidents when we see, of course, the situation at the moment in Pakistan, all eyes have been on this budget and what it entails and what sort of relief it can provide and the kind of balancing act the government that it has to do. How successful do you think the government has been in being able to provide as much relief as they could have with reference to whatever the people can actually benefit from this budget, while at the same time also making sure that they're not just thinking in terms of relief measures for the people now, but also making sure that they are moving in a direction where they can stabilize the economy and then also be able to secure the very important IMF bailout package?
Right. I think it has been a very difficult and challenging year for the government and for the Finance Minister in particular. And there were two major challenges before this budget was announced. One was that our economy had almost hit the rock bottom, 0% growth rate, significant job losses, industry closures, as the reports from the economic survey was released a day before. And the second was long pending IMF program, which you mentioned, and challenges around stabilization. So stabilization and growth and reforms, if we take these three sort of parameters for assessing the budget, I would say that the government has taken some measures in terms of growth. We have seen some degree of incentives for businesses in particular sectors like IT, like agriculture. But at the same time, we haven't seen much reform in the tax structure. For instance, we have seen the continuation of the super tax. In fact, we have seen the super tax has increased. The net so-called has increased, and now even the medium scale enterprises would have to pay an additional tax, which is an anti-growth measure. And from the IMF or the structural or stabilization perspective, I think this is going to be a challenge to get their approval on this budget, to be honest. One, the revenues are a bit unrealistic at this point in time given the growth in the industry, but also we haven't seen any indications on broadening of tax base, which can only occur in our opinion if the tax rates, both income tax and sales tax, are significantly brought down. So we haven't seen that. I think the tax base is not going to be affected in a positive sense, and that is why government is then forced to extract greater level of taxation from the existing tax base. I think these are the initial thoughts on the budget so far.
All right. Ahmed Sahab, when we take a look at the situation, there is, of course, the very important aspect of how it's going to impact the local business community as well, and whether or not the kind of incentives that the government wants to provide to the industries can actually be translated from this budget. There are, of course, various aspects of different sectors and the part of the budget that impact the industry altogether. So perhaps at one look, we may think that a certain measure is impacting the industry in a positive light. But in terms of the rest of the areas and indicators, do you think that comprehensively as a whole the industry will be able to move forward?
Look, it's a very mixed kind of a sentiment. I mean, as far as today's speech of the finance minister is concerned, and the budget particularly for the large scale manufacturing units or industrial growth, we have seen in the last year the industrial growth both sectors, for large manufacturing and this SME sector, especially the industrial growth, are negative. I mean, from a positive aspect of 6.87 and 10 figure coming to the negative portfolios, it's a very alarming situation. We do understand, as per the business community is concerned, we do understand this budget was very tough for the sitting government. We weren't expecting any hope, any incentives to be given to the business community in terms of lowering down the taxations or any other aspects. But we were expecting, rather than giving, finance minister actually thoroughly deliberated on the agriculture side and IT sector, but we failed to hear what he had to say for the manufacturing sector. There were a few proposals which we given to the finance minister across and his board to be considered, and those measures, if they would have taken, I mean, we need to understand this. When we talk about the manufacturing sector, there is a huge employment which is intact. We do see there is a very big risk factor and a question mark when it is an outlook. The outlook of this industrial growth is going to be negative. What is going to be the scenario for the employed people? Keeping in view again that the CIBOR rate is rocket high. We're standing at 21% CIBOR, then the floor rate additional 1 or 2%, 23%. So we have no other option but to say stop our manufacturing units. Whatever the money we have, we just put them in our banks. At least it is a risk-free cost, and we're getting 23% revenue out of it. So the sentiments of the business community were that we wanted to hear at least those abnormalities which were there. We wanted them to, finance minister should have addressed that, and particularly when it comes to the super tax, as he said and mentioned, the super tax was actually, it was for the limited large growth sectors, but now dropping down the figure of 150 million and setting up the super tax on across the board on all the sectors, it is a sentiment that you are actually drilling down only the taxpayers which are already the existing taxpayers. So he should have deliberated a little bit more on this topic, how he is going to accomplish the mission of acquiring the 7,303 billion, how he is going to accomplish that. We see whatever the revenue through strict measures FBR has accomplished in the last year, is actually in the next fiscal year is the total amount is going to go for the repayment of the loans. So he should have at least taken this business community in confidence how he is going to enhance his tax net system.
Right. But Dr. Ahmed, I also want to understand, with reference to what you have said in terms of the industry incentives, why do you think that whatever you're saying is not there and perhaps should have been part of the budget? Is that a consideration you think is because of the current situation we're in and because of the tough measures the government has had to take? Because if the input has also been given by the business community and something that the government can possibly provide, why do you think it isn't there? Or do you think that this is perhaps where the government is indeed limited?
Look, when I say about the incentives, what the business community desires. Look, we are in a position that we are giving, instead of the actual revenue, which tax reform should have been done across the board, but the actual revenue what FBR is collecting from the existing taxpayers, they are now in a position, and at this point in time what we speak, they are actually calculating the tax on advance basis. So the demand what we required from the finance minister was that withholding agent, what the 4.5% in the income tax that I have to withhold whether I do purchase or sale on the sale. So that number should have been dropped down to from 4.5 to 0.5. What incentive? This is a sort of incentive. Our money is actually getting accrued with the FBR. And at the end of the close of the year, we are not been given back the refunds. We understand the tougher situation that the government is in nowhere position that they can allow the refunds to be given back. And second position, it is basically the Sale Tax Act of Section 8B. What it says is it is basically the input is 100%, but the output what we do is 90%. So the 10% they claim, FBR claims, that is the value addition tax. Okay, we understand it is a value addition tax, but I have this leverage that I can do my sale within a time period of 6 months to 1 year. So why to pay when I create my input? I had to straight away with every return I am getting cash dried. Why? Because I have to deposit the cash with my return in shape of value addition tax, which supposed to be, back in the days, it was not a normal practice of the FBR. So business community is again hit hard by the devaluation of our currency.
Right.
We need to understand Pakistan, across every sector in Pakistan, is actually import orientated country. So we import every single thing in Pakistan, hugely relying and dependent on the dollars. Then second, the value, whatever the amount which we had, it actually got diminished by the devaluation. First aspect, what we actually got hit hard by this. Then coming over to this, then actually raw material, the basic raw material of every industry now in this point in time is actually our utilities, electricity and sui gas. So electricity, when it comes, we should have been taken this measures, this fuel adjustment. We do our sales, and after 3 months this fuel adjustment tax comes. Who shall I go and claim those fuel adjustments when I have lodged my returns, when I have claimed my sale? So I mean, these sort of abnormalities. Okay. Then we expected this government to give this. Having said all these things, they have taken some positive measures. They have given incentives to the IT sector. They have given this incentive to the solar manufacturing units. But the drastic action, what the deemed request from the business community that was, at least we are hugely relying on our raw materials of electricity. Right. It should have been subsidized by giving incentives on the solar for the manufacturing sector.
Right, absolutely, and that's important because I wanted to understand this, exactly what the benefit of the incentive really is going to be. And Farrukh, we know, of course, we've seen that there were certain incentives given to particular sectors, and even before the budget, we saw the Prime Minister specifically emphasize on the IT sector as well, and a number of PSDP initiatives have been outlined in the budget. But I want to understand whether or not these incentives will actually materialize into positive developments based on the rest of the factors that are also impacting these decisions.
Right, Sana, I think that when you actually asked Mohammed Ahmed about industry and manufacturing, I was hoping that you are going to ask me about media, but we ended up talking about IT. So IT is very close to my heart, and I'm sure that it is very close to the Prime Ministers and the Finance Ministers as well. And I think that we heard some very good ideas today. not only concessions and incentives that you were talking about, but also creation of a VC, venture capital fund. And that is important because in the end, especially people who are actually toiling in this sector, they need capital. And usually it is something that is not that handy because they don't have the kind of collateral that manufacturing might have or agriculture sector might have. So VCs are good, but the problem that I spotted was that the total number allocated or earmarked was 5 billion rupees. Compared it with the kind of money that is going to be spent on solidarization of tube wells. So, I mean, there you have hundreds of billions, and here you only have 5 billion rupees. So, I'm hoping that in coming days we are going to see bigger chunk being allocated. And by the way, that is not all. Solidarization is of course very important, but laptops, when laptops actually can beat IT sector, their VC fund, that laptops are going to get $10 billion rupees, but here you get 5 billion rupees. So that was my biggest concern. But rest of the policy, Sana, regarding how much incentives can actually, stimulate growth, I think that at this moment, the kind of budget that had to be expected, in that there has been a balancing act, because it seemed impossible. There's a reason I brought up media at the start. I used to work for a private sector company, a channel, and their money was always tight. So we used to have a CFO called Zaki Bhai, and his job used to be that he is going to take money from one person and give it to other, and then the other one cries, he would take money and then would pass on.
Okay.
So I think today I saw Zaki Bhai standing and presenting, the budget. But having said that, regarding what was said earlier, the budget itself and how IMF is going to, the fund is going to perceive it. I think that the government of Pakistan has done a fascinating job of uprising them constantly. So whatever allocations are there, and I'm really chuffed about the idea of increasing salaries, because the working class people have actually been destroyed in the past 1 year or 2 years for that matter because of inflation. So now that they are going to get 35 to 30% increase in their salaries and other compliments as well, that is good news for everybody. But having said that, in the end, we will have to see how this tightrope walk actually continues beyond the term of this government, because this government has a limited term, and this budget is, of course, for the entire year.
Absolutely. Dr. Niaz, it's important also to, of course, see what this budget will mean for the common people. And as Farrukh was pointing out, of course, the increase in salaries is something that looks good in numbers, and we are looking at it as a positive development. But again, in terms of the kind of crisis that Pakistan has been going through and the way that the prices have increased, the inflation has increased, it's very difficult for the people to survive. And I understand that the incentive is offered to be able to help the people, and there is support programs to help the poorer sections of the society as well. But in terms of the kind of net benefit that this actually will create for the people, do you think that it will allow them some sort of breathing space in the next fiscal year?
Well, one major problem that I have to start with all our budgets is the way they are presented in, a very haphazard manner. We must remember that budgets have major implications for our macro and micro economy, and they are a major tool in the hands of the government to pursue its goals for the whole economy. And those goals could be to, provide relief to the poor, as you're asking. It's to, balance the budget. It's to, revitalize manufacturing and exports. It's to, pay off your debts. It's to control the current account deficits and inflation. But our budgets are not explained in this manner. What you have is, just a laundry list presented of the various measures that the government is taking. And, there's no explanation as to, which of the goals that the government is pursuing is this measure addressing, and what overall impact will it have on whatever goals are being presented. So in terms of, poverty alleviation, that should be, the number one goal, given, how high inflation has become in the last several years, especially the last year. But the only major headline item that we've seen is the increase in the salaries of the government employees, which is just one section, and certainly not the poorest section. The poorest are, the people living in villages and slums and on. And at least from the headlines that I have seen, I don't see, any major relief for them, any increase in the BISP or other measures to help them. In terms of, the relief given to the salaried class, it's about 30 to 35%, which barely keeps up with the inflation, which is projected to be close to about 40%. And then in terms of other goals like revitalizing the manufacturing sectors, there are some measures, say for the solar panel sector. There were one or two measures announced for the textile sector in terms of raw material duties and so on. Something for IT. But overall, I would say, the budget hasn't broken new paths in terms of, identifying new revenue sources, especially progressive revenues resources, which will, remove the burden on existing taxpayers as well as on the poor, increase in, progressive direct taxes, in terms of taxing the rich and taxing the untaxed sectors of the economy. So it's a safe budget that doesn't want to rock too many boats. Just keep things moving. No reduction in the huge breaks that we give to the elites. So there is something to keep a lot of different stakeholders happy. And I think the biggest stakeholder is the IMF. It's been made keeping an eye on the IMF. So let's see how the IMF reacts. Will it be acceptable to it, or would it ask the government to impose further taxes and reduce its taxes? So, this budget is, I think, is going to evolve before the June 30th deadline of passing it. And in the weeks to come, we will have, a better ideas as, sub items and sub items get discovered and, commented upon by different analysts. And as the government keeps changing its goals and adding new items, it's only in a few weeks that we'll have a better idea. But overall, I think it's a timid budget.
Right. Dr. Niaz, there is also, of course, the fact that the finance minister has emphasized that this is not an election budget. And even prior to the budget, there were people talking about how, of course, given the current political scenario, there is a lot of decision making with reference to political elements and implications for the party as well. And I understand that they have to also keep in considerations of the IMF as one factor. But do you think that there is anything possibly that you can see in the budget which may have been coming in from a source of a political implication and not a consideration of the economical impact it would have?
Well, just, don't rock the boat itself is, with an eye on the politics of things, because there's a need to, majorly change the structure of Pakistan's import tariffs, the taxation structure, the tax collection methodology, and so on. And, we need huge reform in so many sectors: the taxation sector, the energy sector, state enterprises. And, we need bold steps to, save our economy from sinking further. But you don't see huge steps. And, this budget, as Farrukh was saying, was going to continue for the whole next year. And it's going to be, the budget for the new incoming government, its first year budget. So that, further shrinks the space for reforms for the new government for the whole year. And, unless it brings about, a new mini tax somewhere along the way, major one, to restructure things, then, the government's hands are tied for another year till, they announce their own budget in the new year, next year. But, if we continue with this business as usual things on all fronts, the concern is that, the economy is going to sink further and further in terms of, the debt burden, the current account deficits, the fiscal deficits, unleashing inflation. So we need major reforms in so many ways. And, we want the government to be bold, and that we have yet to see.
All right. Mr. Ali, the situation when we talk about different sectors is important also in terms of what the country's economy is focusing on and the impact that it's going to have. And the agriculture sector is an important one in that regard. And we've seen that a number of initiatives or reliefs have been offered. But again, last year we had the devastating floods, which completely changed the economical scenario as well. And we were talking about the financial justice regarding climate change, even globally. Even this year, we're expecting a similar floods perhaps or some sort of climate-induced disaster. Do you think that the kind of measures that we're talking about that we offer in the agri sector is catering to the possible needs of the people in terms of food security or what the farmers are going to be facing and the impact that that will then have on the overall financial situation of the country?
Well, I think the biggest incentive or biggest attraction which we can offer to our farmer and agriculture sector broadly is price liberalization. And we are not ready to give that because we want to please our urban voters all the time at the cost of keeping the rural population poor. And that is something that can be considered a major step, but none of the government we have seen has worked towards that. And so while we hear about these minor incentives, like for instance, there's a good step. We heard today's budget, the finance minister announced that they're going to remove the duties on the import of agriculture machinery, which is a good step. It is going to help, and but then we are going to see also how much that incentive going to translate broadly across the agriculture sector, because 90% of our agriculture is non-mechanized, small farm holding. So it's not may not translate widely into the agriculture uplifting. We also heard about the proposal for fertilizer subsidies, but that again may not translate directly for benefit of the farmers. It will help maybe the manufacturing sector of the fertilizer. So it's not going to directly help. So as I said, I think the biggest advantage or incentive we can offer is opening up the prices and removing those interprovincial boundaries or restrictions on the commodities which we always impose, and that is something we should have. But on the incentives, let me add a quick point here, because we often see budget as a tool, and also industries and businesses see a budget always as an opportunity to get some advantage. I think this must stop if we want to keep the budget away from distortion and exemptions. The primary objective of the budget should be to offer balanced budget, reduction of expenditure and broadening of tax base, so that the federal government, the economy of the federal government can be at least more sustainable. If we keep looking at budget as only as a tool for incentives, then I'm afraid that it will keep on distorting and misallocating of the capital, and businessmen should be looking at the profits maximization rather than looking at the tax minimization. That should be how the budget should be realigned.
Right. And do you think that the kind of input that the government needs to take perhaps from the people who get most affected in different sectors is part of the budget, and that exercise is done in terms of the current scenario and the stakeholders involved?
Well, I think stakeholders can comment on that. The chambers and business associations have been meeting the finance minister, presenting, and to what extent those proposals were actually materialized. That's a question to be answered. But for instance, there was this Revenue Mobilization Commission which was formed, and although in the document they claim that a lot of consultations were held, but when we talk to the stakeholders in the business, they say this was mostly lip service. So yes, some meetings might have held, but were those consultations meaningful? Was those consultation was based on any kind of research based recommendations? That is a question which is not yet answered.
All right. Mr. Ahmed, the way that we see in the past also the government perhaps announcing different development projects or inaugurating different projects, we've seen that there is a lot of celebration in terms of any government talking about different provinces going forward with important projects that are lasting over years and are big in terms of numbers. But at the same time, we've seen that perhaps most of them have been far too ambitious or have been incomplete and haven't really translated translated into any difference. And even with regards to solarization, there was an ambitious target with reference to all public offices also having some sort of solar panels. But now that we are in this current scenario, there are a lot of development initiatives that this budget also seems to promise. But do you think that there needs to be an emphasis on such macro level developmental projects that the country needs, or at the same time can we actually move forward with both these development projects, ensure their completion, and then also benefit the people in terms of the small scale level?
Well, I think before I say, I think it was very much needed in this point that obviously this is the sentiment whenever the budget comes, that everybody keeps an eye what is the PSDP fund is being allocated, and this year we have seen it has been jumped up from 550 to 1150. So I mean, and having said this, in a scenario when it's a turmoil in the economy and everything has been standstill, especially when it comes to the construction sector. I mean, I'm very pleased to say, I mean, we are very grateful to the finance minister. The extension of REIT, which was due this year, has been extended to further year to the end of 2024. This will not just only lift the hopes, but it will also engage, because we need to understand the construction sector is the only sector which engages 40 to 45 different allied industries along. So development sector always play a very pivotal and vital role in terms of engaging in keeping the economy ongoing. And yes, there are few other things. We do understand that now, until how long with this Pakistan is going to be an import-oriented country, we should do a very, positive measures. I mean, it would have been very great gesture to hear, how to be self-sufficient, how to become Pakistan self-reliance on increasing their export. We should engage our EDF program, that they should do a research R&D sector, should be engaged with every different industry, which is primarily have a big scope of doing an export. IT, no doubt, is an emergent source of remittance at this point in time. Rest, all the other aspects do need a lot of research programs. I mean, giving incentive to agriculture. I mean, very sad to say, our agriculture is unguided. I mean, we do not know. We were hearing stories of having a short of crop in wheat, but alhamdulillah, now it is surplus of wheat. So when we go towards any crop, fertilizing or anything, harvesting, so we directly opt for one thing. So in other way, this year the cotton bales are been reduced. The production of the cotton bales in our country has been drastically reduced. So where again the engaging of textile sector, so how textile is going to first import the cotton bales, then valuation, and then re-exporting. So I think we need to be primarily focused on one thing, that how to increase the export of Pakistan. So we have to be very much mission orientated on every single sector, regardless it is IT, regardless it is agriculture or any export-oriented units.
Right. Mr. Ahmed, there was also the proposal by the Finance Minister of formation of a credit agency, especially in terms of the SMEs and the kind of benefits that would entail in terms of loans from the banks. What do you think about this proposal?
I mean, it's a very important point what he actually discussed. Credit rating agencies, I mean, it has been there, because when we import, likewise, when we import from any country outside Pakistan, we do take, our banks are bound to take the credit ratings from different sources, because either it is complying to the standards of the State Bank. Likewise, now it is going to be happening in Pakistan. It is very good, but I think incentive, given this incentive to the business community by the State Bank, he should have elaborated it very categorically. What are the strict measures? Why not banks are giving, subsidized rates, 6% or 7% to those companies who are actually becoming the source of remittance in Pakistan. So I mean, penalizing them and becoming engaging 20%, taking the responsibility by the government. I mean, it is a very dilute sort of a situation, which yet need another clarification how it is going to be executed.
All right. Dr. Niaz, there is, of course, when we talk about the budget, the various allocations in different sectors that are important. And we've seen previously in the history of the country as well that a lot of times there is criticism regarding the kind of priorities that the government has set, especially in reference to the defense budgets or the education budgets. And there's always some sort of comparison being made as to where the government is really putting their money and the kind of priorities that they are talking about. Do you think that this budget may also raise such questions?
Well, if you just look at the overall structure of the budget, it foresees around 15 trillion rupees of outlays, and that includes 7.5 trillion rupees of debt payment. Then there is another 5 trillion of, transfer to provinces. So what are you left with? And then, there is this huge defense budget of close to and even over 2 trillion if you count everything, and there's no attempt to rationalize or reduce the defense budget. That should have happened. Then you are left with your development expenditure, and that's like a plug figure. It says about 1.1 trillion, but that's going to reduce so many times over the years when there are revenue shortfalls and there are expenditure overshoots. So this development budget is going to be cut over and over again, and we don't know how much we will be left with. Again, the expenditures on education and health are very low, around 1.5, 1.7% of GDP, compared to about 4 to 5% by other countries in Asia. So the fact is that the government really has to find new revenue sources and improve its collection measures, so that at least the existing taxes do get collected and new revenue sources are found which do not put burden on existing taxpayers or on the poor people. But every year we see that the governments just don't take too many measures to do that. There's a need to subsidize, rationalize the subsidies to the rich, to the state enterprises. They gulp up so much subsidies to cover their losses. But again, year after year, you don't really see serious reform by any government. And this is an election year, so obviously it may be afraid to do that. But another angle that you could look at is how much there is in it which will trickle down to the people before the elections. And there are hardly any measures. There is the increase in the salaries of the salaried class that will start from the first month and trickle down to the people. But beyond that, the other things like the development budget, which helps the poor, it's going to take some time for it to be approved and implemented and have some impact on employment and so on. So in terms of making major offers to voters, I think the government hasn't been able to do that because of IMF conditionalities.
Right, absolutely. Farrukh, when we look at this budget, there was a challenge that you pointed out earlier, and that was with reference to the way that the incoming government is going to be able to handle the budget, and what sort of issues will there be in terms of executing it. Even if we take away this particular factor, whoever is going to be looking at this budget, and even if it is the current leadership, when we move ahead with this budget, what else can you possibly think is part of the hindrances that may be in executing this budget and meeting the targets, not just from within the country, but also in terms of global indicators?
Right. First of all, Sana, I think this is a great question because it actually points to the biggest problem that we have, even right now, resource constraint and shortfalls. Right. Whenever you talk about revenue collection or revenue generation, there is usually a shortfall. We go for a very ambitious target, and in the end, we don't meet it right at the point where we promised. So that is going to be the biggest problem in coming days. But I wanted to actually address a couple of things that was said earlier as well, because they are, by virtue of being the last in the row, I get to hear everything and I can actually talk about many very important things. For example, Salman Sahab was actually saying that this policy of keeping cities happy by keeping the rural parts actually poor. And it makes sense because our rural economy has been actually in shambles for quite some time. We have not been able to modernize the way it is supposed to. So I totally agree with what he was saying regarding price, liberalization. But then he spoke about another thing, that was interprovincial liberalization. With any country that is basically a federation, you will see, to try to go to the US and actually take something from one state to the another, right? You will be hounded to death because, there are so different taxation regimes in every state. So I don't think that this interprovincial trade liberalization is something that we can perhaps go for. But price liberalization is a good idea, provided the country is not being faced by such an inflationary pressure already. Dr. Niaz earlier was talking about the speech that was to him haphazard. I just wanted to point out that as someone who has been actually covering, national budgets for past 20 years, if not more, that usually the speech is just a speech, right? But with that, when you are covering there, you are presented with yay tall, stack of papers, and there is entire structure. Now, already I think Darsa went on for hours. If you want to have PowerPoint presentations, then it is going to perhaps be ready to go for something like 7-8 hours, right?
But I think it's also about comprehension. Do you think that the masses understand when we talk about such figures?
The biggest issue is that how much capacity have we built in the country over years to understand economy, right? How many channels do we have, news channels, Sana?
Plenty.
I mean, 50 plus, right?
Yeah.
How many, business channels do we have?
None.
None. There used to be 2. Now they are either entertainment or then they are politics, right? So this is the problem. We have many channels have actually dismantled the capacity to cover economics, and that is astounding because we have a thriving market, right? These are the things that I keep on pointing to, and somehow we don't actually understand that we'll have to do it, because if I want to invest in any market, I want to know what are the rates today, tomorrow, day after tomorrow. So where does it come from? Either apps that are being launched by various companies, or then of course the media. So we'll have to ask this as well. Regarding PSDP also, Dr. Saab was saying that PSDP is the direct method to actually end poverty. My humble summation is that PSDP over the years has become an engine of corruption, right? It has many problems. PSDP and ADP, that is the provincial equivalent of PSDP. Usually what happens is that there are 3 bottlenecks. One, the resource constraint. He was right. In the middle of the year, when money or resources shrink, you cut PSDP to half, right? That is the first thing. Then what happens is that most of the thekas that are given, that also involve a lot of kickbacks. So there you also have corruption. And then amazing thing, after so much that goes on, in the end, Sana, there's a capacity issue that a lot of these funds at the end of year actually lapse because the department or the institution in question cannot even utilize it properly. So we'll have to actually someday sit down and look at how we can actually redo the whole development budget architecture of the country, right? With that kind of a situation, my concern is that in coming days, we will keep on hemorrhaging money, and that becomes a problem. In the end, I was a bit disappointed today, Sana, regarding the real estate sector, because I think that there are 2 things that are killing your economy. One is the policy rate that was actually brought up by Muhammad Ahmed, because it is at such a staggering rate. Why would I want to actually invest in the field when I can take the money to the bank and I can make much bigger and safer profit there? The second thing is real estate, because people keep on sinking money into a sector that does not actually add value to anything. right? It is purely land, just like gold. And in the end, what happens, you cannot export it, but the state of Pakistan keeps on offering more and more concessions to the real estate sector. And in the end, what happens is that when we were talking about provincial, rural-urban divide, there is a third one as well, Sana. Agriculture is shrinking. It is shrinking because of something very interesting, not because of merely cities, but because of the real estate sector expanding. They keep on taking the agricultural land, killing trees and whatnot. And in the end, you have to remember that the land is always finite. If you're sending it or parceling it off to real estate sector, agriculture is going to take a hit.
Right. Thank you very much, Farrukh, and thank you very much, Mr. Mohammed Ahmed, Dr. Ali Salman, and Dr. Niaz Murtaza for joining us and being a part of the discussion. That's all that we have time for, but of course, much remains to be seen as to what is going to be the final budgetary proposal and what sort of incentives the government will be able to provide for a longer time, and not just, of course, the political leadership at the moment, but the next one, and then the challenges that we face. And we hope that whatever the government is promising in terms of the kind of direction that they want to take the country in, whether it is the IMF proposal or of course the much cited charter of economy or a kind of reform direction that the country needs, we hope that we are able to actually take certain decisions which require such a fundamental things to be in place. That's all that we have from the special transmission, and we'll be coming in with more news, of course, from the political and economic side of the country and the world. That's all we have. It's goodbye for now.